So this is a revised version of the speech I prepared for the Holberg Prize that I accepted in June. I have chosen to represent it because it was only after that event that I read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's unusually perceptive words. Now, I don't know if you folks know his name, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a great Kenyan poet and activist from Kenya in Africa who died on the 28th of May. One of the greatest intellectuals of the world, undoubtedly. And I was fortunate enough to have him as a very dear friend. He died on May 28th, and he wrote an essay for me in a collection that I'm editing, and he wrote this sentence. He wrote, I quote Ngugi, "The planet does not need human beings. Human beings need the planet." When I had expressed what I thought was a similar sentiment at the Holberg, a negative, implicitly hostile attitude was bestowed upon planetarity. Matching it was the ethical sentimentality of the human. Ethical sentimentality, not a good thing, of the human. Ngugi, that's his name, the Kenyan philosopher. Ngugi's dispassionate declarative, the planet does not need human beings. Human beings need the planet. Ngugi's dispassionate declarative has changed this. And that change is what I want to share with you. For now, let us turn back to my original script. Over the years, I have written a number of lectures beginning with the word imperatives. The first one was in 1997, almost 30 years ago, when I was asked by the Zurich-based Stiftung Dialogik to mark their change from concern with Holocaust survivors, the Second World War, to concern with global asylum seekers. So they were making this move, and they were kind enough to ask me to give a lecture in Switzerland to show this change. Some years later, in 2018, and that was the first lecture beginning with imperative. Some years later, in 2018, I gave a lecture at Yunnan Normal University in China entitled Imperatives to Reimagine the Silk Road. China was just beginning this policy of Belt and Road, and that was the moment of change where once again I had this idea of giving this lecture. There I gave a description of what not just I, but our group, it was a think tank, that we called Rethinking Globality, wanted to suggest in the face of China's Belt and Road Initiative. An imperative is an urgent command, generally brought about by external circumstances. And in that particular case in Switzerland, 28 years ago, in China it was 21 years, now 28 years ago, external circumstances that had changed from a European saving the Holocaust survivors to a global welcoming asylum seekers from Rwanda, from Turkey, from all over the world. So the change, external circumstances that had changed from a European to a global situation. But the imperative comes from outside, urgent command. One of the magnificences attached to the original Chinese Silk Road enterprise was the great difficulty of actual physical movement through sometimes seemingly insurmountable terrain. Today, the imperative to reimagine that unifying idea of the Great Silk Road comes from the fact that those physical difficulties have been dwarfed through the scientific achievements of global travel. Not hard anymore. As well as networking and accessibility promoted by digitality, yet complicated by geopolitical violence. These have generated the new imperatives that we have proposed in the title, accepted by our Chinese colleagues, Imperatives to Reimagine the Silk Road. Today in globality, I'm skipping a little of what I said then in China, but coming to today in globality, we confront an imperative. Natural, and the Vice President already mentioned this, natural violence has created an imperative to develop a planetary view of the future. What is it to say planetary? You see, when we are on a planet, in the planetary system, in the solar system, then outside the solar system, we cannot think it in the human imagination. That is something completely outside of us. The planet does not need human beings. Even if it explodes and is extinguished, no matter. Planetarity is preserved. It is us, we need, so that there is a kind of sentimentality and self-promotion in climate change work. We are saving the planet. No, sir. The planet does not need to be saved by us. So this is a hard truth that we need to remember. We are talking about humanity. Now, natural violence has created an imperative to develop a planetary view of the future, not a human view. Natural violence, floods, storms, droughts, and wildfires, a river in the sky because the ozone layer becomes more and more impenetrable. Plastic creating volcanic eruptions in the sea bottom. Fossil fuel use destroying our air. Cutting off of the Amazon rainforest, and indeed deforestation of all sorts, taking away clean air, pesticides, and genetically engineered seeds, poisoning the environment and human health. The seasons disappearing, tsunamis and mudslides. Well, there we are. The list goes on. This is the imperative coming from the outside. And the task of the humanities, as Alex mentioned, the task of the humanities is to rearrange desires, not to have the law enforced, but to want the law, to want justice. This is the change that happens. If you only believe in enforcement, or you believe that prosecution can correct corruption, then you're wrong. Because when you enforce, loopholes are found, crime increases. But this other thing, where you teach to want justice, to rearrange desires, not just self-interest, but something else, that's the humanities, the practice of ethical learning. This is the imperative. And the task of the humanities is to rearrange desires so that we learn to want differently rather than think smart capital to supplement degrowth. To think smart capital. Those of you who are involved in climate change work, and I'm sure many of you are, this formula, to think smart capital to supplement degrowth, this is a formula that you understand. But this is not what I'm talking about. By the end of this paper, this sentence will have been fleshed out. For now, it is enough to say that the supplement, I said supplement degrowth, right? So what is supplement? The supplement questions all totalities. Anything that seems to be a totally correct system, the supplement questions. The supplement realizes that there's a hole in that total system, and the supplement tries to manufacture something to fill that hole. So this supplement is something that questions totality. Without this moment, we see totalitarianisms committed to preserving the system at all costs. You know, the United Nations, a fine thing. But once, I mean, I'm involved with the UN, I live in New York. I have lots of friends who have become identified with the UN. Once they're identified, they want to preserve the system rather than do good, which is the formula. So this is what I'm talking about. Without this moment, we see totalitarianisms committed to preserving the system at all costs, all over the world, regardless of left and right. Even imposed and systematic degrowth, you know, the profits of climate change, even imposed and systematic degrowth would be no exception. All our plans, and if you find what I'm saying to be complicated, I'm speaking to the students, please be sure to make a note and ask me a question, okay? I'm not easy to understand. All our plans encounter the limit of the future anterior, the past in the future, a certainty that something will already have happened related to the plans we are launching. Today, the past, in whatever future we can imagine, calls forth geological history, so that some of us think system change rather than climate change is required. Ngugi's wisdom, remember, the planet does not need human beings. Human beings need the planet. Very hard to swallow this one. Ngugi's wisdom reminds us that the requirement is human, this requirement for system change, not planetary. This paper discusses how the humanities can elaborate that change as a human, not a planetary need. Elaborate carries for me, a Europeanist, and I'm saying this also to all the Europeanist students here. If you are doing, as some of you came and spoke to me and said you want to do US culture, you want to do psychoanalysis, learn the languages. The elaborate carries for me, a Europeanist comparativist, the Italian word elaborare in its heart, a shadow of Antonio Gramsci, the activist political philosopher who is one of my brothers. Elaborare for Gramsci means to work out, labor, elaborare, elaborate. For Gramsci means to work out. Therefore, for me, this paper initially imagined how the humanities can work out that systemic change that seems to be the imperative. Even then, however, I realized that if we think of the alternative system as an end, you know, I mean, quite often I was just saying that what happens today is we think of activism as target practice. We've reached the target. That's it. I see this at my university all the time. So if we think that this is an end, the alternative system as an end, rather than a means to a forever incomplete end, ending in a planetary extinction written in geological history, we will spend our time defending the system rather than sustaining the impossible. I'm putting parentheses around I have spent a good deal of time over the decades to justify those parentheses. Let me just explain in a sentence. Sustaining the impossible will to planetarity, in itself a mistake we cannot avoid making. This parenthesis, the parentheses around indicate acknowledging that it is within a phenomenal impossibility that the conditions of possibility are lodged. It may sound difficult when I say it. And again, whenever I speak of difficulty, I'm speaking to the students in the audience. It may sound difficult, but believe me, in the doing, if you are actually, and again, the Vice President was kind enough to mention something which I believe is true. Whether I'm good or bad, I don't know. But the fact is I am an activist. I do learn a lot by doing, not just thinking that thinking is an end. And if you do these things, this thing that sounds so complicated when I describe it actually comes clear. I'll repeat it, and you keep that in mind. It is within a phenomenal impossibility that the conditions of possibility are lodged, and thereafter we act accordingly. We must also remember that the planet is not phenomenal. It does not appear as such, apophanestai, the phenomenality, it appears, not an essence, but it appears. But the planet does not appear to us as a planet. We can't access the planetary system as a practical matter. The humanities beyond the disciplines, in the teaching and learning mode, can elaborate the will to planetarity in many ways. In 1997, when I first thought planetarity, I believe now that I was also offering a more robust model of secularism as an imagination of the transcendental, rather than a privatization of a belief in the supernatural attendant upon religious history in Europe. Let me explain this. I'm going to skip a little later so that I don't take up too much time. See, in places like India, even the United States, as the world globalizes, the old ways of thinking, the longue durée, are coming back. The Silk Road is a proof of that, in China. And so quite often we find that what we have is theocracies. Today, for example, the situation in Israel, a theocracy. So as the situation in India, a kind of genocidal theocracy. Now, this kind of thing, when you have a theocracy, then the old European story, because after all, we did not undergo the European history of first the church and then the Reformation. Remember, in the old days in Europe, it was the church that was clean. Iglesia was clean. And the seculum, the world, was dirty, marked by birth and all that kind of stuff. It was after the Reformation that it changed. And then what were we asked to do? Something the European Enlightenment told us, that we would privatize religion, like going to the bathroom. It was away from the state. It doesn't happen that way. Religion with its moral force remains there. And therefore, in fact, we do not have real secularism anywhere. Believe me, I live in the United States. The moral majority is Christian, white, imperative Christian. So that this idea, and I am from India, the moral majority is Islamophobic, genocidal Hindu. So this kind of thing, the need for a new kind of secularism, which will see that the common person enters the ethical public sphere generally through religion, was already there in the speech that I gave. I'm not going to quote it. See where okay, my way of thinking moves, changing as the situation changes. Not all situational changes are sequential. In the case of planetarity, as environmental damage, however, because of a disproportionately large practice of such damaging policy, we seem surrendered to a fast-paced sequentiality, so that the epistemological question has changed to how shall we integrate our reimagining of the future into a general activist position against the Anthropocene and acknowledge the modernity of the fourth world. Okay, let me just say what I mean by this. the epistemological question. Why do I say epistemological question? Because that's what the humanities do. The humanities try to rearrange desires. Many people tell me that they are really changing people's minds. I know immediately that they're not doing anything. Because you believe me, I've been teaching. I became a tenure track assistant professor in the fall of 1965. I've been teaching full-time at a university all over the world for 60 years. If there's one thing I know, it is that minds cannot be changed. What you can do is rearrange the desires that already exist. That's about the best, and even that doesn't last. This is hard work. People think the humanities are easy. No, sir. It's much harder than teaching the production of knowledge. The humanities teach the practice of learning, not the production of knowledge. So therefore, in this kind of a situation, you have to know. This is why a one-shot deal is not, this is why I was very pleased that you said that maybe there will be exchange between you and me, because it takes time. A one-shot deal cannot really do anything about, because I have to know the general pattern of what you want. I must know the class well enough to know the general pattern of what they want. I can do this kind of a thing with the 14 weeks of a semester at Columbia, and I certainly can do that kind of a thing with the landless, illiterate, untouchable tribals in India, because they don't have anyone but me. So to an extent, that the rearrangement of desires, and you quoted me, Alex, as uncoercive rearrangement of desires. What does it mean, uncoercive? All education is coercive. So how is it, because something is being changed? Why do I say uncoercive? I say uncoercive to mark that future anterior business that I just mentioned. You've undoubtedly forgotten it by now, so let me say it again. When we plan something, we know, and good politicians know this. This is not just humanities teachers. We know that something else will have happened. Whatever we plan, even if we plan structurally very, very well, it is not what is going to happen. There will be some change. That's the future anterior. Something else will have happened. And because the good practitioner, the good activist, the good leader, the good politician, the good follower knows this, therefore it becomes in principle uncoercive. Because you do not push the person. You do not push the person. I'm laughing because someone is sleeping. I'm always extremely pleased when I put people to sleep. Anyway, this is peculiar. My mother would say, "You're really crazy. Why are you happy if people sleep?" I say, well, but the thing is, so that's why I use the word uncoercive. Uncoercive, because we know that we must plan as carefully as we can, and yet that's not what's going to happen. This is the thing. We have to. So the epistemological question, how I rearrange desires, has integrated reimagining a general activist position against the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, everybody knows that word now. It is basically a nice word which describes the effects of human greed. Greed. The basic human affects are greed, fear, and violence. And humanities education actually shifts these and changes the pattern of desire, rearranges the pattern of desire. And the Anthropocene is, and even smart capital sees how much greedy can we be. How much can we be greedy and still? And so those are the calculations. How do I know? Because I'm involved in all kinds of projects which try to teach me that this is what we should do, including projects run by my very dear friend Jeffrey Sachs at my own university. You know, the Millennium Projects. So that, and they are all not all, but most of these are undertaken in good faith, but they're wrong. So to an extent, this idea, okay, so imagining into a general activist position against the Anthropocene, undermining greed, in other words, and you see greed as a human affect, the best, strongest human affect, is not just ugly. You know, when a mother says, my son, that too is greed. You know, so that it's the idea of, I must live, going to the doctor, that too is greed. Without greed, you can't, it's a greed to remain alive. It's a bigger thing than just wanting something. So so we shouldn't, I'll tell you a story which I was telling people yesterday. I see you and I'm remembering our wonderful dinner. I was telling people yesterday at dinner, you know, these subalterns, the people that I teach in the villages, they don't have access to the public sphere. They don't have access to the public sphere. They vote, but they're not allowed the rights of citizenship. So their public sphere is either religion or proverbs. So I do a lot with proverbs because religion is a bit complicated. So there is a very good proverb in Bengali, which is, Lobhe paap, pape mrityu. That is to say, greed is sin, and through sin, death. Beautiful, strong proverb. So I say to my students in the villages, so is this true? And they will say, yes, this is true. I said, no. Don't you like money? I like money. We are greedy. So yes, sister. So then I said, let me revise this proverb. The proverb is lobhe labh. There is profit in greed. Eker labhe oneker mrityu. That is to say, with the profit of one, many people die. That's the proverb. So to an extent, you see, you have to come into these fighting the Anthropocene on this level. You know, because greed is a bottom line affect of the human being. You don't just have to be David Rockefeller to be able to undertake the Anthropocene. At any rate, so I have been invited to become a member of something called the Future of Philanthropic Investment. That is not the way, and time will not let me develop this now. Our imperative today may be the reimagination of a completely inaccessible future, rather than because of what has already happened, because of the workings of greed. I mean, in the United States, we are going back to fossil fuels. It's a difficult situation that we are in. So our imperative today may be the reimagination of a completely inaccessible future, rather than only our perceived demands for inclusiveness and diversity. It is no use sentimentalizing in the name of our descendants. I'm constantly asked to talk about what world shall we leave for our grandchildren? What world shall we leave for our grandchildren's grandchildren? That kind of time for that kind of sentimentality is over. It is no use sentimentalizing in the name of our descendants. The planet is not for human beings to bequeath. The best for us is to contain the Anthropocene, and the time for it may be past. If we are scared off by the talk of a monstrous future, let us remember it will be monstrous only for animate beings, human beings, not for the planet. The planet needs no human language descriptions. There is no room for human accountability in the greater planetary narrative. These are hard things to think, but we must be able to think them. And within that step forward planetarity, we might as well imagine monstrosity as indistinguishable from the transcendental. Monstrosity as indistinguishable from the transcendental. For planetarity is not accessible to the value form, liberal or, quote, materialist. In the planetary, the question of human value is not even absurd. It doesn't even make absurdity. The planet does not need human beings. I normally teach myself and my students the distinction between historical responsibility. See, I'm born a caste Hindu. And so my historical responsibility, the reason why I have those schools to repay ancestral debt, is toward the fact that we screwed them. Colonialism was just yesterday, but we have been destroying those people now for thousands of years. That's a historical responsibility. And I say to them, look, I'm your enemy. I'm good, my parents were good, but 2 generations do not undo thousands of years of extreme domination. And so, therefore, you must learn to do without me. So this, I teach them the difference between personal responsibility and historical responsibility. That distinction does not disappear, but becomes somewhat irrelevant when we are thrust into planetarity by way of the Anthropocene unrestrained. I cite here a possibly resonant remark by an activist friend whom I greatly respected and whom Amitav Ghosh used in his The Hungry Tide. He wrote, Tushar Kanjilal was his name, I don't want to lose faith in mankind and thereby lower my guilt quotient. You see that arithmetical sense of my own guilt. This is something Tusharda wrote, but this is no good anymore. Let us now turn to a passage I composed in 2014 about activism. In spite of our forays into what we metaphorize differently as outer and inner space, what is above and beyond our own reach is not continuous with us. I mean, you know, this is again hard to understand, but if you think of it, I live on a street called Riverside Drive, okay? So I'm walking along Riverside Drive. If I look up, beyond the immediate layer is outer space. So and I cannot metaphorize that. I can't go there. So therefore, what is above and beyond our own reach is not continuous with us, as it is not indeed specifically discontinuous. You see, people talk all the time who want to be very nice about all this planetary stuff, that, you know, we are all islands in water, etc., etc. They forget that we cannot live in water. We can live on Earth, we can breathe the air, but we are in a world, on a planet, where what holds the whole world is not amenable to our existence. We cannot exist in water. We need all kinds of things in order to exist. This is something they forget as they celebrate the ocean. But anyway, so we must persistently educate ourselves into this peculiar mindset. Here, what is being described is an example of my usual understanding of activist method. Given that we have happened on a planet, activism can only be short-term, undertaken in terms of an immediate definition of success. We cannot philosophize about grand world-saving goals, yet in persuading people, especially children, I teach children after all, to rearrange their desires, we do need a bit of easy philosophy, poetic philosophy, remembering that poetry is not for belief. So this, what I'm going to say now, is not necessarily something that one rationally would believe. Okay, now, here it is, something like this. Think and feel, the whole world is my home. The whole world holds me up, including the fire in its center and the water all the way down to the absurd ocean, quote, floor in a sphere. No one can throw me away from the world, even if somehow I were to travel in space. Ownership is a made-up thing. We cannot own the whole world, or each one of us already, quote, owns it in the only way that it can be owned, by contributing to the whole of it. Remember, this is an irreducible description for a human need for the planet. Imagining the impossibility of a planetary future, one is hung loose in the eternal immediacy of subaltern time. I always use subaltern in the Gramscian sense. This is Gramsci's definition: small social groups in the margins of history. Small social groups in the margins of history, whose statements are never used to actually construct the history of countries. I tried to describe subaltern time in my remarks at the Shanghai Biennale some years ago, but not to much avail. And this is how it is: a held back time in which nothing resembling history can yet happen, an empty time, and lived as empty, the time of their condition itself. If you work with subalterns, you have this sense of the difference in the sense of time. And so the point might now be, in the face of the imminent destruction of the world as we know it, to pray to be accessed by this stationary time, since human accessibility to planetary time, measured in light years, can only be negated as affirmed by human calculus externally. Yet the cracked and now hyper-real story of historical advantages, promising a future that has not been reimagined, still leads my Columbia students to a sense of exceptionalist euphoria. American exceptionalism. We are going to save the world. One choice, of course, is to say, go ahead, play at being custodians, when what you're really doing is using the fact that the human is not nature. The human makes more than it needs, Anthropocene as mere excess, whereas the earth is, by the seeming non-identity via agriculture, that apparent excess is how primitive accumulation enters into the first social formations through the capitalization of land. The earth is identical with itself. Now, I had actually put together, I have spoken now for about 35 minutes. I had put together 2 PowerPoints. The first PowerPoint would have come now. It was, as I say, the earth is adequate to itself. I'm not going to show the PowerPoint, but let me tell you what it would have been. I'll show the second PowerPoint. What it was some years ago, it's called, it was done in French first, it was called Arrêtez les cartographes, to stop the map makers. Okay, and it was a discussion with Derrida, who had said that breaking a path through the forest was the first writing, even before map making, to break the path. And I had said to Derrida that, we must be able to imagine the feminine transcendental, which writes, the boustrophodon, which writes round and round and round and round, and not like this. And I had taken the story of Sita, who was found from the Ramayana, one of our epics, who was found at the end of a plow, at the end of a langal. That's the word we still use for a plow. And Alex, I'm really saying this because I saw in the archipelagic writings reference to the Ramayana. You can't refer to things in the past just like a footnote. you know, that the Ramayana is a critical text. It's an interesting text, you know, and it's the same way with all those words like nus, antar, etc., etc. Etymologism, you can't do it. The past is alive. So that's another reason why I had the thing. So at any rate, because this female was found at the end of a plow, in fact, she's not marriageable. So that when she was married, no bride price could be extracted. And she cannot last. The feminine transcendental is not historical. She cannot last. And beautiful passage in the original whatchamacallit, Ramayana, the passage always mistranslated. But in Sanskrit, it's like absolutely legal language. I have not thought of anyone but this husband. And therefore, earth, open wide, just the way in which a dentist says. And the earth opens wide, and she goes, because she cannot last. It's a philosophical thing. So this was my first PowerPoint. It's an interesting way to look at this, but I'm not going to use it now because I think that'll make my talk very, very long. Okay, so all I will say here is that the earth is identical with itself, whereas the human being can make more than it needs, and therefore the materialist definition of the human is that it's super adequate to itself, and so therefore the human being will always be destructive of nature. It's not something that we can do anything about, so that it's something that we have to think about right from the start. And I want to give you one example here that you should think about. I mean, here we are in East Asia, but this is an African example. The so-called oral languages of Africa are not really oral. I call them mnemic languages, M-N-E-M-I-C, mnemic languages. They're written on the memory, like digitizing before the fact. The missionaries came in with primitive tools like vocabularies, grammars, pencil, paper, taking those languages and separating them. And they systematized some lingua francas, a useful thing, you know, like Swahili, like Zulu, like Hausa, like there are others that are systematized by the missionaries. But there are thousands of mother tongues in Africa which remain mnemic. Now, the memories are, and they're used. They're not just to be preserved by the United Nations. That's because the United Nations doesn't go down that far. Like I was saying, the subaltern is not accessed. But they're used by politicians at times of elections so that there will be ethnic prejudice, but ethnic violence, etc., etc. They're survival languages. But if you think, I'm not romanticizing Africa. There are enough Africans to romanticize Africa. I'm saying something theoretical here. In the event something else happened. But the nature of these mnemic languages is such that they are built to combat the Anthropocene. Because anybody who does anything practices the doing, and nothing is left behind. It's all there. So today, the very top-level linguists are interested in how these languages are learned. But we should think about it, because generally speaking, we don't give a damn about Africa unless we're African or Africanists. But it is something to think about. And as I say, I'm not romanticizing. Africa also went to hell like every place else, because they're also human with violence and greed and fear. Anyway, so let's go to my school. So placed in this situation of two humanities teacher jobs, one among the superpower, wishing to help the marginalized, and one among the Bengali subalterns going from day to day, I can fill my workday with the effort, now for nothing, to push desire around. And then I give a description of what I do at Columbia, and that's where this PowerPoint fits. But now, to end, I will read what I do in the villages. So I say, so much for the Research One University where I teach, hoping against hope to produce collective policy intervention as we read our world as Earth, beyond the disciplines. And now even that is hopelessly short-term. What about the ungeneralizable subaltern schools where I also teach? You see, that's a definition of the subaltern, again by Gramsci. The subaltern is unrealizable. The subaltern in Korea will not, cannot be treated the same way as the subalterns were in Purva Bardhaman, where I am now. Anyway, so what about the ungeneralizable subaltern schools where I also teach? Last month, at a public event, when my oldest college friend, Shomik Bandyopadhyay, met in 1956, when I was 14 and he was 16. When my oldest college friend, Shomik Bandyopadhyay, asked me at a public event how I survived the complete disappearance of our hope after the Second World War of creating a sane and just world, I told him that at top and bottom, I imagined an impossible future. So this reimagining, I've been trying to give you the wisdom of Ngugi's sentence, but I'm now also sharing with you my activist weakness. We need something so that we can remain an activist. So I imagined an impossible future and tried to activate a pedagogy that attempted to put into play the intuitions of democracy. Here are my subaltern students. They have mostly not ever moved out of the environs of their villages, so that I will say that if we take the places where we live as models of action, we forget these people at the bottom who do not move. I mean, you know, Calcutta is only 95 miles from where I teach. My best smart teacher has never been to Calcutta. You know, it's the station is 45 minutes, so one cannot imagine poverty like that because, as I say, it's way below the NGO radar. I've not seen NGOs at work in these kinds of areas. So they have never seen an ocean or even a lake, never seen a hill or a mountain. And in their state-issued textbook, and I teach the state texts because I want them to enter the mainstream. I teach in a different way. In their state-issued textbook, the Earth and the Sun and the planets are small balls, and the Earth, seemingly larger than the Sun, is described as spinning like a top, which relates not at all to their experience, so there is no cartographic sense at all. I wish I could go into detail here about how we sit on the ground together and sense the Earth's impossible roundness and sense ourselves into its slow revolution. You know, if you put a stick and the sun moves, after an hour and a half you say, look, the Earth has gone that far. We went round too that far. It's very slow. This is an amazing experience for most of them. You know, we know the Earth is a sundial. You can see that it's moving. Anyway, I tell them Galileo's story. I wish I could go into detail here, etc. And sense ourselves into its slow revolution, and with the help of my friends and relatives on the other side, because of course they're in the United States, on the other side, they're hanging down. Why aren't they falling? There's gravity for you. Okay, so friends and relatives on the other side learn heliocentric day and night at once via Google Video. I've given everybody little smartphones. They remind themselves of gravity, since these friends are hanging upside down on the other side of the globe and yet not falling off. But that still does not bring us into planetarity or show its discontinuous alterity. They do not read books, apart from the textbooks from which they teach and from which they passed their exams in the past, which the government takes back. I gave my supervisor, Ujjal Lohar, a man in his late 40s, who has an untouchable so-called, who has studied up to class 7 in the state system, and with whom I have worked for over 20 years, and who had never read a book except those textbooks, right? a book on science. I gave to him a book on science prepared in Bengali for imagined high school students by diasporic Bengali scientists in the San Francisco Bay Area in the United States. He read it and said to me when I went again to the school, "Sister, outer space is something else." Like, Didi, Mahakasha kichu ekta. Mahakasha, outer space. He read it and said to me, "Sister, outer space is something else." I prepared a tiny video clip for him, subtitled in Bengali, and shared it with my two teachers, Sundari Kishku and Budin Hemrom, and with Anirban Bhattaji, my assistant director. They had seen pictures of the round earth on their smartphones, supplied by me. Now they saw it through human eyes. I invited them to imagine that outer space was cross-hatched by lines of force that made the planets move, and discussed European antiquities' imagination of the music of the spheres. I talked to them a lot about the intolerable heat of our fiery young sun and sent them a video of the music of the sun.
5.3 psi, 48% RH.
See, all of this for the supervisor is very exciting.
SpaceX copies test matrix 1 and HUD readout.
Crew ops check, EV1's good.
EV1's good. Question good.
Okay, stepping into vertical translation. We're going to start with the horizontal bars.
Okay, now the sun's music.
Dispersive chirping waves, Langmuir waves, and Doctor Who-like Whistler mode waves.
So this was very exciting for them to hear the music of the spheres, as it were. Sundari was intrigued by the idea of an ocean floor in a sphere, and with the idea of fire there as well. She asked why, if the earth floated in water, there was such water shortage. So I found a tiny clip of volcanoes underwater, made a subtitle or two, and I'm waiting to discuss it with her. For water shortage, I showed her Namibian women learning to live with drought rather than offer an explanation. She will learn to learn if I can supply initializing answers.
Whatever we do, we are going to have to adapt to a hotter planet. In Namibia, amid a dusty landscape baked by drought, there's a vivid patch of green where a class is being taught how to cope without rain.
We know now, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years to come, we don't know even whether we're going to get even a single drop of rain. And therefore, we need now to come up with something which is going to help the children.
See, they don't have a drought. That area of West Bengal is full of water, and so they waste water. What I'm trying to give them is the idea that we're all connected, that when they waste water, water's wasted there. It may not be practically true, but it is certainly imaginatively necessary for these wonderful teachers of mine. Anyway, they are so far below the NGO radar that these subaltern groups are not often bothered by human rights advocates. But even when they are, since they have not been brought up with the liberal self-sense of individuals with inalienable rights, they are furthest from the subjectship which would approach the subjectship of human rights. Therefore, human rights talk for them is not very different from top-down philanthropy with no structural support. To be understood, it would ask for a sustained labor in subject formation that must be undertaken by way of an education that must not look to succeed as a deliverable, but rather continue persistently from generation to generation. This is my task as I understood it in 2020, but it must be performed today in the imagining of the temporary for permanent, since we have come to a very alarming place. Within the task, as I understood it in 2020, I wanted to give them, through developing educational technique, a sense of responsibility for saving their home, the whole world, rather than always be told they're victims. They must now learn the temporary for permanent mindset, within which this unusual lesson of responsibility rather than guilt must be learned. This is learned more easily by them than by us, because the insubstantiality of life is their daily sense of things. Let us see how the children learn that the world does not need them. Even a year ago, I thought long term. As I wrote, we have been copying bits of television programs that show climate disasters, that speak to the subalterns, who are my students, teachers, and supervisors. We have been subtitling them in Bengali. When the program is copied, we make a cut that has been accessible to the subaltern groups that we know. And then, for yet another new thought, we are thinking of putting subtitles in as many subaltern languages of the world as we can access. This can, of course, be magically broad, etc. I am not going to tell you the whole plan and what's happening to them now that I've read Mugi, etc., etc. I'm not going to show you really the rather wonderful BBC thing on water and the contrast between London and Bangladesh, which really spoke to them, nor about plastic. And so let me now go to this is the last movement, okay. At a certain point, they had asked me to go through the earth lesson, you know, like sitting down, feeling the earth's roundness, etc., with the entire village, guardians included. I now think it was because they felt this knowledge should be available to their contemporaries, their elders. The first time around, I had thought their request unreasonable and had a silly earth class, which I knew was not going to succeed. But now I see, we will see in July, it didn't happen because it rained too much, if we can perhaps redo the class. If middle-class readers of international novels are taught to wonder if the earth speaks through their text, this is my Columbia classes, these men and some women must be able to protect themselves from the impossibility of imagining a future by claiming the earth calls them in some way. How should I tell them that the planet does not need humans? But I must. The goal of these schools had been to see if a pedagogy could be developed that would insert the intuitions of democracy in subaltern children as habits of mind. I now can see that the everyday sharing textured practice, textured, not just structured, textured practice of, I say it's like invisible mending. Most people these days don't even know what that is. But invisible mending, where you actually go into the fabric that you're mending and weave with your needle, textured. The everyday sharing textured practice of democratic habit formation has now entered their agency concerns. This is amazing for me. Remembering the temporary as permanent imperative, our attempt to do the earth class with a group of generally illiterate and poor adults will be a challenging response to this imperative seeming to invite a double bind. In 2023, Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva at New York University invited me to a group conversation about democracy. I asked my village teachers to send me videos. I choose 2 out of the few they sent, and that's where I will end. Now wait, you see, so all I tell them was, hey, send me something. Here in America, I'm supposed to have a conversation about democracy. That's all I said, okay? So, and these are completely poor, so-called untouchable tribals, etc., and very ill-taught, okay? But sharp as sharp can be, and they resonate with me. They like me because I like them, and very few ruling class people actually like them. They can come and be benevolent, but that's a very different thing. So I told them that, okay? And in the event, the New Yorkers didn't even, I mean, this was a very unusual thing that they sent videos. I don't even know how they learned to make those. But the New Yorkers paid no attention. They were so occupied in praising themselves that this didn't happen. So now show first the woman. Listen carefully, okay?
তুমি ভোট দাও হ্যাঁ
Okay, so she votes. That's it, the first one.
তোমার নাম কি
Now go to the second one. It's
আচ্ছা
funny as
দাদা
hell.
আপনার নাম? আমার নাম হচ্ছে বাবলু মাড্ডি। আচ্ছা দাদা আপনি তো ভোট দেন? হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ দিই। আচ্ছা ভোট দিলে কি হয়? ভোটের মানে কি একটু বলতে পারবেন?
বলতে পারছি না, ভোট সবাই দেয়, আমিও দিই, কিন্তু মানেটা কিচ্ছু জানি না, বুঝতে পারি না মানেটা।
তার মানে ভোট মানে কি আপনি জানেন না?
না না,
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে।
সবাই দেয় তাই দিতে যাই, চলে আসি ভোট দিয়ে।
Okay, so that's the man. They may not, they sent quite a few. I've chosen these two for you. These may not be verifiably representative, but by way of fiction, my teacher sent me a message. We do not know what it is to vote. The man says so openly, and the woman is not asked. The man might have been lying or joking, and the woman might have been able to explain what it is to vote. But that is not the point. The point is that the videographic fiction sends us the message, teach us democracy. Further, that they know enough to know that they do not know enough. Structural democracy is planning for the short-term future until the next elections. Possible even in these trivialized times, and that's all they want. Possible even in these trivialized times, even if the time for textural democracy, in the robust, epistemologically felicitous sense of democracy for other people, democracy as persistent revolution may well be over as mere human greed unleashes a wounded planetarity. Think of the implications of this, please, as I thank you and sit down.